This is the story of Saul, the first king of Israel. Chosen by God to lead the people, Saul began his reign with great victories and a promise of success. However, throughout his journey, disobedience and pride took him away from the divine plan, leading him to a tragic end. His life teaches us that it is not enough to start well. It is necessary to persevere in faith and obedience to God until the end. The people of Israel were experiencing a time of great unrest. For years, they were governed by judges, leaders chosen by God to guide the people in times of crisis. However, something started to change. Looking at the nations around them, the Israelites felt they were missing something: a king, someone who could lead them in battle, organize the kingdom, and bring stability. This need grew until it became an outcry. "We want a king." That's what they said to the prophet Samuel. At first, Samuel resisted. He knew that by asking for a king, the people were rejecting God's leadership. But following divine instructions, Samuel accepted the mission to find the one who would be the first king of Israel. And that's when Saul appeared. Saul was a tall, strong, good-looking young man from the small tribe of Benjamin. He didn't seem born for royalty. He was just an ordinary person, searching for his father's lost donkeys. But it was during this simple task that he encountered Samuel, and the fate of his life changed forever. When Samuel looked at Saul, God spoke to the prophet's heart. "This is the man who will rule my people." Even with Saul's hesitation, Samuel anointed him in secret, pouring oil on his head, thus sealing the beginning of a new era for Israel. The anointing was not just a symbolic gesture, but something that profoundly transformed Saul's life. The Spirit of God came upon him with power. But how would the people react upon learning that the new king had been chosen? Not long after his anointing, Saul still seemed like the same young man, unsure of his new responsibility. When Samuel summoned the people to present their king, Saul, instead of being at the front, was hiding among the luggage, as if he wanted to escape that moment. However, when he was found and brought before the crowd, his height and presence impressed everyone. "Is this the man the Lord chose?" they asked each other. And the people, seeing his imposing stature, cried out, "Long live the king!" Although accepted by many, Saul knew that being anointed did not mean being prepared. However, the opportunity to prove his worth did not take long to appear. The Ammonites, Israel's traditional enemies, surrounded the city of Jabesh-Gilead and sent a cruel message. The inhabitants could surrender, but in exchange, they would have their right eyes gouged out. The news spread throughout Israel, and despair gripped the people. Nobody knew how to act. It was then that Saul, still working in the fields, learned of the situation. Upon hearing the story, something changed within him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him with strength, awakening his courage and leadership. In a bold move, he cut 2 oxen into pieces and sent them throughout Israel, threatening those who would not join him in battle against the Ammonites. The fear of the Lord seized the people, and a great army was formed. With wisdom and boldness, Saul led the Israelites to a decisive victory over the Ammonites. The city was saved, and Saul's name gained respect among everyone. The victory against the Ammonites consolidated Saul as king in the eyes of Israel. The people were united and full of confidence in their leadership. However, the true test of his reign was yet to come. The Philistines, powerful and well-organized enemies, began to threaten Israel's borders again. Tensions increased, and the people, in fear, awaited Saul's command. Samuel had given Saul a clear order. He must wait 7 days for the prophet to arrive to offer sacrifices to God before any battle. It was a matter of obedience and patience. The days passed, and the war scenario became even more tense. The Philistines were getting closer and closer, and Saul's soldiers, terrified, began to desert. Little by little, the great army that had been formed began to disperse, until there were few men left at the king's side. Each hour that passed seemed to increase Saul's anxiety. He saw his army dwindling and his enemies approaching, but Samuel had not yet arrived. The pressure on the king was unbearable, and he felt he could wait no longer. Fearing that he would be defeated without God's blessing, Saul made a decision that would change the course of his life. He offered the sacrifice himself. The moment he finished the ritual, Samuel finally arrived. The prophet, upon seeing what Saul had done, was deeply disappointed. "What did you do?" asked Samuel in a serious tone. Saul tried to justify his attitude, talking about the pressure he faced, but Samuel was firm. He warned him that his impatience would cost him dearly. Samuel's warning echoed in Saul's mind for a while, but he did not stop to reflect deeply on his error. The king still had many battles ahead, and the next mission was decisive. God, through Samuel, gave Saul a direct order to completely destroy the Amalekites, a people enemy of Israel. This included not only the soldiers, but also the king, animals, and all possessions. It was a clear mission, with no room for interpretation. Saul gathered his army and marched against the Amalekites. The victory was swift and devastating, but as the battlefield calmed, something began to change in the king's heart. He looked around and saw that there were many healthy and valuable animals among the things. Furthermore, King Agag himself was captured alive. The idea of saving the best of the herd, supposedly to offer as a sacrifice to the Lord, it seemed Saul a sensible solution. After all, why destroy something so valuable? When Samuel arrived at the camp, it didn't take long for him to realize that something was wrong. The sound of the animals that had been spared was clear evidence of Saul's disobedience. "What is this sheep bleating I hear?" asked the prophet sternly. Saul, without hesitation, explained that he saved the best to offer God, but Samuel was not convinced. "Obedience is better than sacrifice," he said firmly. It was at that moment that the sentence on Saul became final. God had rejected him as king. Saul was still on the throne, but something inside him had changed. The Spirit of God, which had guided and strengthened him in battle, now away. He felt this growing emptiness, a restlessness he couldn't explain, and at the same time, unbeknownst to him, God had already chosen Israel's next king. Samuel, obeying the Lord's order, went to Jesse's house in Bethlehem to find the one who would take Saul's place. Among Jesse's sons, the most unlikely one was chosen: David, a young shepherd with a simple and unremarkable appearance. However, God saw what no one else could see. The prophet anointed David in secret, and from that moment on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Meanwhile, Saul increasingly suffered from an internal storm. An evil spirit afflicted him, bringing constant anguish that none of his advisors could alleviate. It was then that someone suggested a solution: find a skilled musician to play the harp and calm the king's troubled spirit. And, in yet another of these encounters that seemed to be the work of destiny, David, the young shepherd anointed as the future king, was called to the palace to serve Saul. David, with his harp, brought immediate relief to the king. When he played, the evil spirit moved away, and Saul experienced moments of peace. He didn't know it yet, but the young man who played to soothe his soul would be the one who would one day take his place on the throne. David, still serving as a musician in the palace, would soon stand out for more than his harp skills. Amidst the constant threats from the Philistines, a new enemy emerged that terrified Israel: Goliath, a giant warrior who challenged the Israelites to one-on-one combat. For 40 days, Saul's army was paralyzed by fear. No soldier dared to face him. It was in this scenario that David, still a young shepherd, appeared to deliver provisions to his brothers who were on the battlefield. Upon hearing Goliath's challenge, he was outraged. How could a man insult the army of the living God and get away with it? With unexpected courage, David offered to face the giant, trusting not in his strength, but in God's protection. Saul, upon seeing David, was skeptical. How could that boy, with no experience in battles, face such a feared warrior? But David was determined. He told the king how God had helped him kill a lion and a bear while tending sheep, and he believed the Lord would do the same to Goliath. With no other alternative, Saul allowed him to go, clothing David in his own armor. But David, feeling uncomfortable, preferred to face Goliath with his simple shepherd's tools, a sling and 5 smooth stones. In front of everyone, with just 1 stone thrown with precision, David defeated Goliath. The victory was so swift and impressive that the Philistine army fled in panic. David's victory over Goliath spread throughout the kingdom, and his popularity grew rapidly. The young shepherd became Israel's hero. The people cheered him, singing in the streets. Saul killed thousands, but David, tens of thousands. What initially seemed like a song of praise turned into an open wound in Saul's pride. The king, who had previously seen David as a talented and harmless young man, now saw him as a threat. Saul could not ignore David's growing influence. With each victory in battles, with each gesture of courage, David's name was exalted, while the king's shadow seemed to shrink. Envy began to poison Saul's heart, and the feeling that God had turned away from him only left him, worsened this bitterness. From that moment on, Saul began to observe David with different eyes, full of suspicion and concern. The coexistence between the two became unsustainable. In one of the rages that affected him, Saul tried to kill David by throwing a spear at him. While the young man played the harp to calm him down, David managed to dodge it, but the danger was clear. Saul no longer trusted him, and the desire to see him dead began to take shape. The king, determined to get rid of the threat David posed, sent him on dangerous missions, hoping he would not return alive. But instead, David always returned victorious, winning the hearts of the people even more. Now Saul knew he would have to take more extreme measures to eliminate the one he saw as his rival for his throne. Saul's obsession with eliminating David grew every day. He could no longer think of anything other than getting rid of the young man who, in his eyes, threatened the throne. David, realizing the imminent danger, began to flee from Saul. The hunt spread across deserts, caves, and cities, with Saul mobilizing the army of Israel to find and kill David. The persecution was relentless, but surprisingly, David always managed to escape. In the midst of this escape, there were 2 moments that could have completely changed their fate. Twice, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but both times he refused. In the first, while hiding in a cave, David and his men saw Saul enter, not knowing they were there. Even though his men encouraged him to take advantage of the opportunity, David only cut off a piece of Saul's cloak as proof that he could have killed him, but chose to spare his life. When Saul heard about this, he was shaken. He cried and recognized that David was more righteous than him, but this was not enough to stop the persecution. On the second occasion, David again approached Saul while he was sleeping in his camp. One of David's companions suggested that they kill him, but David refused, saying that he would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. Once again, he spared Saul's life, demonstrating his loyalty to God even though he was unfairly hunted. Saul, however, did not give up. Saul's despair only increased as time passed. He could not kill David, and the weight of God's abandonment afflicted him more and more. Their enemies were growing all around, and the worst of them, the Philistines, were preparing a decisive attack. The Israeli army was about to face a crucial battle at Mount Gilboa, and Saul, knowing the gravity of the situation, felt fear rising in his chest. He needed an answer, a direction, but God no longer spoke to him, not by dreams, not by prophets. Desperate, Saul made a decision that he himself had forbidden in his kingdom. He looked for a medium. In disguise, he went to Endor, where a woman known for communicating with the dead lived. Saul knew he was breaking with everything he had defended as king, but his despair spoke louder. He ordered the medium to invoke the spirit of Samuel, the prophet who had once anointed him as king. To everyone's shock, Samuel appeared, but his message was not at all comforting. Samuel's spirit, stern and direct, announced that the battle was lost before it even began. The Philistines would win, and Saul and his sons would die on the battlefield. The fate was sealed. Saul's heart, already afflicted, sank into utter despair. He knew his days were numbered, but even so, he had to face the battle that lay ahead. At the dawn of the battle on Mount Gilboa, the mood was heavy and gloomy. Saul, his heart weighed down by the prediction of his own death, led an army that already seemed defeated before they even raised their swords. The Philistines advanced with strength, and the army of Israel, without God's favor, began to crumble before the enemy. Before long, the situation became desperate. Saul's sons, including Jonathan, his faithful heir, were killed in battle. Saul, seeing the devastation around him, was seriously wounded by Philistine archers. Knowing that capture was inevitable, and fearing humiliation at the hands of his enemies, Saul made a final and tragic decision. He asked his squire to kill him, but the young man, terrified, refused. With no other choice, Saul threw himself on his own sword, ending his life on the battlefield, surrounded by defeat and despair. News of the death of Saul and his sons spread quickly. The Philistines, upon finding the bodies, desecrated Saul, beheading him and displaying his head and armor as war trophies. His mutilated body was hung on the city walls of Bethshean as a final humiliation. But amid the desolation, a gesture of loyalty still echoed. The brave men of Jabesh Gilead, who had never forgotten how Saul had saved them years before, risked their lives to rescue the fallen king's body. They brought him back and buried him with honor. Even in his tragic death, Saul still received one last act of respect. The news of the death of Saul and his sons reached David, who was far from the battlefield. Although Saul had having spent the last few years chasing David, trying to take his life at all costs, the young man felt no relief with the king's fall. On the contrary, his heart was filled with sadness. Saul had been the first king of Israel, God's anointed, and on top of everything, Jonathan, his best friend, had also fallen in that battle. The pain of loss weighed on him like an immense burden. David, moved, composed a song of lamentation that would echo among the Israelites for generations. In it, he extolled the bravery of Saul and Jonathan. "How the mighty have fallen," he said, recognizing the virtues of the two men, despite everything that had happened. It was a display of honor and respect that few would expect from someone who had suffered so much at the hands of Saul. Even in the midst of persecution, David never stopped seeing Saul as God's chosen one, someone who, in the beginning, carried great promise and potential. David's lament was not only a tribute to Saul and Jonathan, but also a reflection on the end of an era. The nation of Israel now found itself without a king, without clear leadership, and the void left by Saul's death opened space for the next chapter of history. With Saul's death, the nation of Israel found itself in a time of uncertainty. The man who had once been chosen by God to lead the people, who began his reign with great victories and the promise of a new era, had now fallen, disobedient, and far from the divine will. But even in the midst of his tragedy, Saul left an undeniable legacy. His story, marked by moments of courage and daring, was also a powerful warning about the dangers of disobedience and pride. David, now with the path open to the throne, observed the shadow that Saul left behind. Saul's reign, although begun with God's blessing, had been marred by hasty decisions and a heart that gradually turned away from obedience. Saul's initial victories were great, but his inability to fully trust God and follow his instructions was what slowly led to his downfall. David knew that as Israel's new anointed, he would need to learn from the mistakes of his predecessor. He would need to not only win battles, but also maintain a faithful and obedient heart to the Lord. The transition of power between Saul and David symbolized much more than the exchange of kings. It was the beginning of a new stage for Israel, an era that David would have to lead wisely, learning not only from his own experiences, but also from the ups and downs of the previous king. Saul, who started out with such great potential, had lost his way. Israel's future, however, was just beginning, and with it came profound lessons to be understood. Saul's life reveals a complex and nuanced trajectory. He was the first king of Israel, chosen by God, someone who began his reign with humility and great victories. There was in him the promise of a strong leader, a man who could have guided Israel through many years of prosperity. However, little by little, Saul allowed insecurity and pride to take over his heart. His impatience with God's orders and lack of trust in divine instructions became his greatest enemy. Each of Saul's disobediences took him further away from God, and the throne, which at first seemed to be his calling, became a heavy burden. The power he so sought to maintain ended up corrupting him, and his mistaken decisions brought devastating consequences not only for him but for the entire nation of Israel. His obsession with David and fear of losing the throne blinded him to the truth that he had strayed from God's plan long before. Saul's story teaches us that starting well is important, but the real test is how we follow through to the end. Obedience to God is what sustains a leader, and without it, even the most promising of paths can end in ruin. Saul shows us the danger of letting pride, envy, and fear overcome faith and trust in God. Looking at his life, we are reminded that it is not the beginning that determines our story, but the way we persevere in God's ways. And for David, who now assumed the throne, this would be a lesson he could never forget. If you liked Saul's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.